Vom continua forumul privind reformarea justiției și combaterea corupției. În scurt timp va începe sesiunea a doua a evenimentului nostru, care este organizată în cadrul proiectului Susținerea eforturilor de integritate și anticorupție prin monitorizare activă de către societatea civilă în Moldova, implementat de Centrul de Resurse Juridice din Moldova cu sprijinul financiar al Departamentului de Stat al Statelor Unite, prin intermediul Biroului Internațional pentru Justiție Penală și Aplicarea Legii al Ambasadei SUA în țara noastră. În această primă parte vom discuta cu domnul Richard Nephew, care este coordonator privind combaterea corupției la nivel mondial în cadrul Departamentului de Stat al Statelor Unite ale Americii. Îi voi acorda cuvântul domnului Nephew, care are o experiență vastă în acest domeniu de combatere a corupției, inclusiv în anumite zone ale lumii care s-au confruntat sau se mai confruntă cu acest flagel și sunt absolut convins că experiența dumnealui va fi una utilă și necesară pentru eforturile pe care, iată, le depunem de atâția ani pentru a face ordine în acest domeniu. Domnule Nephew, vă rog.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I want to express my appreciation to the Legal Resource Center of Moldova for organizing today's forum and for hosting me. I was sorry to miss this morning's session, as I had some difficulties with my flights in Vienna, and I was especially sorry to miss the opportunity to hear President Sandu outline the Moldovan government's ongoing anti-corruption reforms. These efforts are taking place in the face of unrelenting challenges, and I know they cannot be easy. But I also know that the benefits from these reforms will be well worth the effort. I'm very excited for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon about the U.S. anti-corruption agenda and how we are partnering with Moldova to counter corruption. I also look forward to your questions. Last December, Secretary Blinken created my position to elevate and integrate anti-corruption across U.S. diplomacy and foreign assistance, and to facilitate the department's anti-corruption work with partners around the world. Though I may be the first global anti-corruption coordinator at the State Department, I know that I am entering this role alongside an incredibly active group of anti-corruption reformers, including at the State Department, who have been working on this agenda for many years. My team and I will build upon and catalyze this solid foundation. We'll do so by engaging across the U.S. government, with foreign governments, and with non-governmental partners to bolster progress towards global anti-corruption goals. This will include quite a bit of travel to meet with partners. In fact, this visit to Chisinau concludes my first trip as coordinator. In its first year, the Biden-Harris administration made fighting corruption a core national security interest and foreign policy priority. In that vein, the White House released the first ever U.S. strategy on countering corruption alongside the First Summit for Democracy last December, an event at which we were honored to receive remarks from President Sandu during the anti-corruption panel. Our strategy recognizes the corrosive effect of corruption on fundamental components of a thriving society, such as public service delivery, security, human rights, and economic development. As a result, corruption undermines good governance and threatens the democratic values we strive to uphold. Importantly, this is a threat not just faced here in Moldova, but in the United States, in every country I visited on this trip, and the international community in general. Corruption leaves no part of the globe untouched. It is a common scourge for us to confront together. Although we're proud of our successes combating corruption, we know being a global leader demands that we must humbly acknowledge and address our own shortcomings in the United States. For example, the United States' deficiencies around beneficial ownership has long been highlighted in multilateral conferences, peer reviews, and internal assessments, which is one of the reasons why Congress enacted the Corporate Transparency Act, or CTA, and why this administration is working hard to implement it. Our strategy provides a blueprint for how we will work domestically and internationally with governmental and non-governmental partners to prevent, limit, and respond to corruption and related crimes. It also outlines the variety of tools that we have to do so. There are many, ranging from capacity building and foreign assistance programs, to sanctions, to economic development, to diplomacy. None of these tools exist in one single place in our government, nor, I would wager, do they exist in any one single place in any government. Moreover, none of these tools is itself a silver bullet or cost-free. This work is time-consuming and requires sustained investment. To be successful requires not only coordination and cooperation within governments, but among them, so as to maximize our impact and share the burden. It can be done. One example of this integrated approach can be seen in our response to Russia's brutal and unjustified war on Ukraine. Our approach includes the enforcement of sanctions to freeze assets, the use of seizures where evasion of sanctions can be proven, the deployment of visa restrictions, and the provision of additional anti-corruption assistance to Eastern European partners. All of this reflects our determination to stand up together with our partners to kleptocrats such as Putin. In our response to Russia's invasion and commensurate efforts to respond to its corrupt practices, we see the seeds of an effective strategy of integrating our tools to respond to corruption challenges in other countries as well as around the world, an area of work we intend to pursue in the future. Real progress is going to require a bundle of reforms and persistence by all parties to achieve results informed by an understanding of what works in particular contexts. On that note, we welcome Moldova's leadership in the global fight against corruption. The Moldovan government and non-governmental partners have continued to advance anti-corruption reforms, even amidst Russia's war on Ukraine and domestic challenges. We've been encouraged by the close alignment between the government's anti-corruption reforms and priorities and our own U.S. strategy on countering corruption. The citizens of Moldova clearly signaled their desire to rid their country of corruption and strengthen the independence of democratic institutions when they elected President Sandu in 2020 and the pro-reform PAS government in 2021. Moldova's path to Western integration and reform is a model for how democracies can work to deliver for their citizens, and Moldova's new EU candidate status reflects hard work and commitment to reform rule of law institutions, counter corruption, and create a more inclusive and democratic society. It is clear that reformers in Moldova and across the region are now seizing windows of opportunity to fight corruption and kleptocracy. The United States strongly commends the government for enacting measures in the last year to increase judicial independence, promote transparency in the financial sector, and improve accountability in the Prosecutor General's office. We also support initiatives such as the implementation of integrity screening for prosecutorial and judicial oversight councils candidates. And we look forward to seeing the results of the work of the new chief anti-corruption prosecutor. Across these efforts, I want to praise the Moldovan government for making its anti-corruption policies the focus of its commitments during the Summit for Democracy's Year of Action. This includes efforts to increase judicial integrity, strengthen anti-corruption bodies, and promote transparent campaign finance. We also appreciate the government's participation in our Summit for Democracy cohorts, a real opportunity to learn and work together in our fight against corruption. Moldovan civil society, media, and the private sector have continued to play an instrumental role in countering corruption. We have been active supporters of these non-governmental actors throughout Moldova's democratic development. While preventing and combating corruption is fundamentally a government responsibility, the role of civil society, media, and the private sector is and will continue to be essential for reforms to stick. As we move forward together, the United States is committed to providing support for Moldova's continued anti-corruption reform. We recognize this undertaking is no small task. Individuals engaged in corrupt acts will resist, both individually and in networks. They have every incentive to do so, and we have every imperative to deny them success. The U.S. Embassy here, through both the Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement and USAID, is supporting this effort by embedding an advisor at the Ministry of Justice, enabling the work of the Independent Pre-Vetting Commission, and increasing the capacity of the National Institute of Justice. We're also supporting civil society, such as LRCM, to convene the array of actors involved in anti-corruption reforms, including today's forum. We recognize the role that impunity plays in perpetrating systemic corruption, and the United States is continuing to apply all available tools, such as criminal prosecution, imposition of sanctions, visa restrictions, and enforcement actions to promote accountability for corrupt and destabilizing actors. This includes fugitive oligarchs undermining Moldova's democratic reforms, both here in Moldova and from abroad. To this end, our embassy is working with civil society and the government of Moldova to gather the evidence needed to apply such tools to those who have robbed the Moldovan treasury and people of billions of dollars that should have been invested in this country's future. Most importantly, we welcome continued political will for anti-corruption reform at the highest levels of government. Whenever possible, we look forward to leveraging our European Democratic Resilience Initiative to support the range of reforms you're undertaking as a condition for EU candidacy. In addition, we welcome continued implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Center's recommendations, as well as steps Moldova is making towards full implementation of FATF recommendations. We will also support updates to public administration reform strategy and related public financial management reforms. Finally, it will be important to pass legislation to ensure protection of journalists, civil society, and others exposing corruption against baseless legal proceedings. Despite the challenges, Moldova has a good story to tell to the international community and, I believe, to its own population, one of persistence in the face of opposition. We look forward to the government's continued progress on its Summit for Democracy commitments in advance of the second summit next year, where more of the story can be told. We also welcome Moldovan government and Moldovan civil society participation in the 20th International Anti-Corruption Conference, which the United States is co-hosting with Transparency International from December 6th through 10th in Washington, D.C. This will bring together the global anti-corruption community around the theme of uprooting corruption and defending democratic values, and highlight the partnership between government, private sector, and civil society. To close, I want to reiterate my confidence in our continued partnership in the fight against corruption and reaffirm the United States' commitment to support your efforts here in Moldova. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Da, domnule Nephew, vă mulțumim și noi foarte mult pentru faptul că sunteți astăzi aici. Mulțumim și partenerilor noștri din Statele Unite care de-a lungul timpului au susținut eforturile statului, uneori mai mult declarate decât în practică, de a lupta cu corupția, pentru că în cel puțin ultimii 10 ani noi am văzut această susținere necondiționată din partea Statelor Unite. Din păcate, autoritățile de aici nu au reușit să implementeze sau nu au reușit să-și respecte promisiunile în implementarea reformelor anticorupție. Acum, de un an de zile, avem un alt guvern care a venit, care a preluat puterea prin puternice promisiuni anticorupție, prin promisiuni privind reformarea justiției și vreau să vă întreb cum calificați, chiar dacă ați putea să faceți o comparație a felului în care au decurs lucrurile anterior și cum decurg lucrurile acum, dacă putem să fim mai optimiști și că într-un viitor cert vom putea să avem cu adevărat o justiție mai independentă și mai puțin coruptă.
No, thank you very much for the question. I would say two things. First, to me, one of the most difficult things to create is political will, both political will of the population and political will of the government, to be able to advance the kinds of reforms that are quite difficult to achieve. There are always going to be political factors, there are going to be economic interests, there are going to be cultural factors that make it difficult to bring together a population and bring together a government. And so if you're able to have that kind of serious political will, both from the population and the people in charge, that's a significant amount of the effort you need to do to advance real reform. And so I would say that alone would give me real reason to be hopeful and optimistic, because you can see that here in terms of the civil society engagement, in terms of the government's interaction, and the number of people who are interested in making real reform and making real progress. I think the second reason to be optimistic is you have the support of the international community. Not only in general, because anti-corruption is something that I think a lot of us think is a good thing and would like to find ways to support where possible, but in this particular moment, I think we're all paying a lot more attention to the dangerous effects that can be had from corruption being able to run unfettered. We're seeing this in Ukraine. We're also seeing this in a number of other different places where the consequences of corruption, in the case of Ukraine, is in Russian invasion and the debilitating conflict that's ongoing. In other countries, we see it in the form of widespread concern about democratic stability and a lot of concern about what the future might bring. But that means you have a large group of countries that right now see corruption as a threat. It's a threat from a national security perspective, it's a threat from a political perspective, and all of that means is that not only are you working on this, but you have a lot of friends and partners who are doing the same.
Da, și vă mulțumim pentru această susținere pe care ne-o acordați. O să rog și pe cei din sală care au întrebări să nu ezite și să le adreseze. Și voi continua ideea noastră pentru că, într-adevăr, avem acest război în regiune și cumva și din felul în care se derulează acest război absolut nedrept, vedem cât de mult poate să afecteze corupția zona aceasta a lumii. Vedem pe de o parte o armată putred de coruptă care era considerată drept a doua a lumii și o armată mult mai mică și mult mai bine organizată care cu solidarizarea întregii lumi, este adevărat, rezistă și oferă succese impresionante. Ce ar putea sau ce ar trebui Republica Moldova să învețe, inclusiv văzând ceea ce se întâmplă aici foarte aproape în Ucraina?
No, it's a great question, and I would say there are three key lessons that I would identify. First, when threatened, I think countries can come together. And in this case, the threat is an external one. It's coming from Russia's invasion and its unprovoked attack on Ukraine. But I think there are many forms of attack. There are many forms of risk that countries and populations can face. And I think when a population identifies the kind of threats that it's facing and comes together in rejection of them, that's when they can be most effective in reform, that's when they can be most effective in responding. And I think that is one great lesson that the Ukrainians, I think, are teaching all of us, is that when we face real risk to our systems, to our way of life, we can come together. And so I think in this, they give me optimism every day when you see what the Ukrainians have been able to achieve. And I think it's a lesson that Moldova can take in the true risks and threats that come from corruption, which, again, is the president identified is a national security threat. It's a national security threat to the United States. It's a national security threat, I would argue, to many of our partners. So I think that's one. I think the second is that corruption ultimately is theft. Corruption is theft. You know, it's important to use the word corruption. It's important to think through the theory and the thoughts and the complex academic discourse around corruption, because it allows you to think about specific strategies that you can use to respond to it. But to me, I think it's quite simple. Corruption's theft. It's stealing from a population, stealing from development, it's stealing from people who are trying to advance the well-being of their nation. And so we see this in the case of Russia. The corruption that pervaded the Russian military very evidently was theft against that and made it very difficult for that military to function in the way that I think a lot of folks thought. And I think you can make the similar argument that corruption around the world is, again, it's theft, and it steals from populations. And so in terms of the response that ought to generate, to me, I don't particularly like the idea of people stealing from me, and I don't think many people do. And so the idea that simplifying this concept and thinking about it as theft, in my view, helps us to also think through the nature of the problem and to be much more specific in what we want to try and do in response. And then I think that the third thing is that notwithstanding the challenges that exist, we can do more than one thing at once. I think the Ukrainians are demonstrating through their consistent work and effort at anti-corruption reform, which they're continuing throughout the invasion, shows that even as they are facing truly existential crisis in the East, they are still committed to the idea of rule of law, they're committed to the idea of reform, they're committed to the idea of improving their corruption legislation and implementation. And I think that suggests that while we all face problems nationally, while we all have a number of different challenges, it shows both the importance and the fact that these two things can be done at once, which means that all of us, in my opinion, don't have much of an excuse. When the United States has anti-corruption legislation it's contemplating, we should look at the Ukrainians and say, see, they're managing to respond to an invasion. Surely we can come together and think about ways we can improve our own systems. And I think you could make the same argument about other countries.
Da, și probabil aș mai adăuga eu cel mai puternic semnal este că ucrainenii în acest moment luptă pentru democrație, pentru libertate, pentru un viitor european și fără corupție. Avem o întrebare din sală de la domnul Victor Munteanu, rog să-i transmită cineva microfonul.
Hear me? Yeah? Okay, great.
It's okay.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Nephew. So, look, in Moldova, I think we did a great job because we decrypted basically the architecture of the $1 billion theft, and we also decrypted the whole machinery of the money laundering of 20 billion. Okay, so we know who the actors are, we know who the beneficiaries are, we know where they are, we know what kind of luxury life they have now, be it in London or Tel Aviv. And we also know that Moldovan civil society and the well-intended people, actors, made a huge effort, I guess, to advocacy work in the United States to determine number of senators to ask President Biden to put the names of those individuals, some of them, on the Magnitsky list. My question is, what is the bottleneck now? Why these guys are not there yet? And let's suppose one day they will be there, so what? Can you explain it to the Moldovan society, for the thousands of people who are watching now, us? What are the benefits for us as those who fight systemic corruption and organized crime once those guys are on the list? And if you can also tell us a bit more about other opportunities, like the Magnitsky list, which might be around and we are not aware of. Thank you.
No, very happy to, and thank you very much for the question. I'll do the second part first. So in terms of the effects, the simplest way of putting it is that a designation under Global Magnitsky Act and the associated executive orders essentially institutes a requirement for an asset freeze on financial assets that are held in U.S. financial institutions, as well as a related set of visa restrictions that also can come into effect as well. So the effects, essentially can be any assets that are held in the United States therefore have to be frozen or not in a position to be utilized by the person who is so designated, right? And the same thing with visa restrictions. Visa restrictions means you can't travel to the United States. So from that standpoint, the Global Magnitsky Act and the associated sanctions, in my opinion, are a fairly significant set of measures that can be imposed against individuals. And I'll say, too, as someone who's spent now 20 years working on sanctions policy, I was quite skeptical of Global Magnitsky Act when it was first being discussed in the United States. I wasn't convinced that it would have the same kinds of effects that other sanctions potentially might. I'm happy to say that I was wrong, that I think that the Global Magnitsky Act has demonstrated that it can both have a deterrent effect as well as it can appreciably diminish the opportunities of people who are subject to sanctions. So that's an important set of things that are there. I think the effects of Magnitsky sanctions, though, of course, are a lot stronger when you have other countries engaged in them as well. And so it's worth noting, of course, the United States has a Magnitsky Act, but so do other countries in the international community. The Canadians, for instance, have a global Magnitsky Act, and there are other countries that do as well, although some don't call them Magnitsky Acts, but the practical effect is much the same. And so when you're able to bring together a number of countries, that allows you to have much, much greater impact, because it's not just US financial institutions, it's Canadian financial institutions and others that might be on the list. So in terms of answering your question, it's a fairly significant set of tools. And I think when financial institutions are forced to freeze assets, it also identifies them, which then potentially could be useful in any kind of law enforcement process in which assets are then recovered and returned to the countries that have had assets stolen from them, as could potentially be the case here. You asked about the bottlenecks in terms of why some individuals haven't been subject to sanctions or not. I'm not authorized to get in any discussion about particular individuals and where their cases are. And in part, that's a good thing. It may be a frustrating thing, but it's a good thing. And I'll say that's because ultimately it comes down to a rule of law principle. We do not take these kinds of sanction steps without making sure that we have passed evidentiary boundaries that have been set in law, to make sure that we are using these tools as Congress demands, and to ensure that the constitutional protections that exist, even for non-US citizens, but who are operating in the US financial system and so forth, are protected. So in many ways, it's a demonstration of the rule of law that we can't just snap our fingers and have these sorts of sanctions in place without evidence coming forward that actually demonstrates the causes that are there. When evidence is received, and I know there are different standards that anyone in this room might have for, there's enough evidence, why are you saying there's not enough evidence? Of course, there are all sorts of other rules that have to come in terms of how recent the evidence is, how much you can be able to prove it in a court of law, and candidly, whether or not you're able to defend it in a court challenge. And I'll say that in our experience, we're very much focused and concerned on making sure that we would win any kind of court challenge, and that means that we hold a very high and very clear evidentiary standard to ensure that our sanctions are used in the most correct way possible to avoid those sorts of risks. So the process is the process. I, as a practitioner, have often wished that it would be faster. We can sometimes find ways in which we can make it faster, but I can assure you that we are evaluating the information that we have, and we're doing so with all the existing procedures that we have to ensure that we take any action that we might take in a way that is sound and defensible in all comers.
Da, vă mulțumim, domnule Nephew, și contăm pe sprijinul Statelor Unite în identificarea bunurilor pe care toți acești oligarhi le au și le au jefuind statul. Noi vom continua în câteva minute printr-o dezbatere asupra procedurii de pre-vetting și a reformei Curții Supreme de Justiție. Îi vor ruga și pe cei care ne urmăresc online și pe cei din sală să fie activi, pentru că este într-adevăr o problemă care îi privește pe mulți dintre cei de aici și sunt absolut convins că aveți multe întrebări, deci pregătiți-le și cu toții veți avea acest drept.